Okay. So it's only been a month that Wake of Malice has been out, and how has it been? How's been the response? What are people loving about it? I was seeing some of the reviews, and people are absolutely loving the book. What are you hearing?
Oh, I'm hearing the same, which is so much fun. The thing that really delights me is that people are finding it funny because I think Gothic humor has a tremendous potential to be hilarious.
Hmm.
And it's one of the things I love about Gothic humor, either unintentional hilarity or I try to play with it a little bit. So the fact that people were walking away laughing, it is a book that's all about death, and
Hmm.
laughter is my awkward coping mechanism. So I'm hearing a lot of people saying, "Oh, that was so funny. That
Hmm.
was so funny."
That's cool. I saw the review from Father Lawrence Liu that I thought was hilarious, where he's like a little bit afraid to come out of his cell late at night because of all the, I think I haven't read the whole thing yet, but he says there's like these occult events that happened in the book, and
Mhm.
that immediately is like, ooh, that really intrigues me with that sort of thing. So I want to come back and ask you, you have your specialty is in anti-Catholic sentiment, I think during the Victorian or the Edwardian period?
Primarily Victorian, but I did a
Victorian.
lot of research starting with the Reformation onward.
Okay.
Anti-Catholicism is one of the hallmarks of
Yeah.
English literature, so I really have been in love with that topic for several decades at this point.
Okay. So, like I said right before we hit record, I really want to ask you a little bit more about that. And maybe you've talked that to death, but I am just curious to hear you go on about it. And especially in light of our audience and the kind of stuff that we're trying to encourage people to write in light of where the culture's at and how it's progressed in the last couple of hundred
Mhm.
years and so on. So I know it's your favorite talking point, but let's talk about Wake of Malice just for a minute, if you would. Uh, You've got a character. He's a bit described like Father Brown. I was reading the first couple of chapters, and it's had a very Chestertonian feel from the few novels of Chesterton that I've read. You're you coming back to the same character now, I think, for is it the third time across your
Mhm.
novels? Are you did you plan for it to be a series, or it's just a serendipitous series of sequels?
It's just, the character emerged in the first chapter of my first Gothic novel, and I loved the character, but I had this theory that he would be an excellent um, exorcist battling the preternatural, but he'd be a terrible narrator because we have a Gothic novel and it's a very matter-of-fact Dominican friar who isn't freaking out, who's just able to dispatch the preternatural.
Okay.
And I mean, he confects the Eucharist every day. So, true ghostly, ghoulies, vampires, not a big deal. So, with my first novel, I came up with this notion of having a narrator who could freak out. My first narrator is not only non-Catholic, he's anti-Catholic. So it's alarming for him to think about vampires, but it's also alarming for him to think about all these crazy English papists, and that really is scary. And just Father Thomas Edmund Gilroy lent himself so well to that that he became the recurring character, not the recurring narrator, not the recurring narrator. So just having him be battling the preternatural, but having the narrative of mystery and discovery and terror unfolding for someone who can freak out alongside the reader works so well. And it just sort of repeated itself. And the first one was about vampires. Then it made sense I had to do werewolves. And then it
That's
sort
what
of
it
made
does.
sense I had to
Yep.
do zombies.
Yeah.
So it just sort of progresses.
What's the next obvious thing? Whether it's not ever gets written, what is the next obvious thing beyond that trio?
I'm not actually sure. I've gotten a ton of recommendations. Um, I don't know because each of them has also played with witchcraft and things like that. So I've dealt with a lot of the elements of the occult.
Mhm.
Um, I even thought of doing something with more water-based demons, but I've also dabbled with that too. So I don't know. We're gonna wait and see. I
Okay.
might give Father Thomas Edmund Gilroy a break,
Hmm.
but time writing, as many in your audience will know, writing happens in sort of the
When it happens. Yep.
craziness of life. So it's
Mhm.
we'll see.
So I want to actually ask why this character, but and why he matters to you. Before I do that, uh, given this fun and riveting um, themes, these topics that you're writing about, what's been the biggest complaint that people have leveled against you? And what do you think about that? What they have to say?
I would say the two biggest I've gotten. Actually, I'm going to have to say three. The first is on rare occasions I get there are an awful lot of words in this novel, which I
Okay.
mean I'm a Victorianist, and
Okay.
actually I'm pretty restrained for a Victorianist. But that's sort of like, that's way over there. That's for people who don't actually want to read, which is fine. That's fine.
Mhm.
But what I get from the Catholics is they freak out about the preternatural. And what I get from the non-Catholics is they freak out a little bit about the Catholics. So it's that same dynamic.
Okay.
So I find myself as an ambassador, not just to non-Catholic readers, but an ambassador to Catholic readers. I'm giving a talk to some book clubs, local book clubs in a couple of weeks, and the whole topic is going to be why on earth would a Catholic novelist write horror? And my premise is I don't write horror because horror is more the modern version of the genre, and it's been
Mhm.
denuded of
Mhm.
its spiritual richness. It's become a
Mhm.
little bit more nihilistic. It's more violent than I like. So I
Mhm.
said, Gothic. You need to understand what Gothic actually is. That I write, but horror, I don't read it. I don't write it. I can't watch it.
Mhm.
That just sort of, for me, conjures up a degree of despairing violence without redemptive thread
Mhm.
that I
Mhm.
can't stomach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So why this character then? Like you say, he's not an unreliable narrator, but he's a well, why couldn't he be the narrator? Like, I guess the question is, what is it you love about this character such that he's just the perfect person to carry this series of books?
Well, he was actually, I had a theory about how to write a Gothic novel before I wrote it. I'd been working on Dracula for a very long time. I edited the Ignatius Critical Edition of Dracula. And I thought, really to be effective, you need an exorcist. And for to be an effective exorcist, you need someone who is not going to be shocked or frightened or alarmed, very
Mhm.
clinical, not even
Mhm.
clinical, scholastic. So if you think
Mhm.
about Dominicans, they're sort of academic and they're
Mhm.
not easily flustered. I've also known Dominicans for many, many years. I'm very close to many Dominicans, worked at a Dominican parish. They've been very influential in our personal life. So I just felt that it was funny to take these highly academic friars, these friars preacher who
Mhm.
are preaching truth, and then to say well, they would be really well suited to this particular battle. And it was also directly inspired by one Dominican in particular, Father Thomas Joseph White, who's now the head of the Angelicum in Rome. He was a good friend, and I met him while I was on retreat with some nuns.
Mhm.
And he said to me something about on retreat, there's one thing you need to do. And so I tried to sit up straighter because he's a genius, brilliant theologian. He said, well, take a
Mhm.
nap. So I said,
Mhm.
okay. I took a nap. Right before I fell asleep, I looked up on the wall and they had an image of Veronica's veil. And I thought, Catholics are perfect for battling the preternatural because we're weirder than the preternatural.
Mhm.
And then I fell asleep and had a dream about the first chapter of Bloody Habit, which introduced
Wow.
that character.
Mhm.
And I woke up and I wrote it. Uh, the hilarious thing is Father Thomas Joseph White couldn't stand the character in the first book, liked
Oh,
him
really?
better in the second book, and he hasn't told me yet what he thinks of the third book. Um, but I said, well, he was partly based on you, just very academic. And when you made the Chesterton connection, which always makes me laugh because I did not remotely think of Father Brown when I was writing it,
Mm.
but I did think about a monk named Michael in The Ball and the Cross, which is my personal favorite
Okay.
Chesterton novel. So there was a Chesterton influence. It just wasn't Father Brown. Although rereading Father Brown, I went, I can see why people are saying this.
Mhm.
Um, but because I've had the Father Brown suggestion more than once from people. So, and I'm proud. I'll take a Chesterton comparison any day.
So why zombies then? What is it about them as just a topic that you thought, okay, I need to just do this for however many hours it took to write this thing?
Well, I had to particularize it because the vampires and werewolves were more interesting just as a genre or a part of the genre as monsters. Um, Zombies, because they are, they're dead bodies that are now reanimated
Hmm.
and they lose so much of their personality. I thought, oh, we gotta liven this up. So the central threat is zombie leprechauns, but I also pulled in a ton of other Irish
Okay.
folklore.
Wow. Okay.
Um, because I thought another element is I've gone from the Dominicans, the second book I had Franciscans with the Dominicans. And this time
Okay.
someone had said, do the Jesuits. I said, all right, Jesuits, they are sent out as an army of one and they evangelize often solo in outlandish places. I'm not really outlandish, but I'm going to go to the west coast of Ireland and I'm going to have a Jesuit who's the one who's caught in all the trouble. I'm going to have a Jesuit, and I'm going to send Father Thomas Edmund Gilroy out, and we're going to deal with Irish folklore and dead bodies, lots of dead bodies, um, and how people respond to the dead bodies and the threat of disrespect
Hmm.
of human bodies and what that signifies. So yeah, I spent a lot of time interested in death
Yeah.
with
What's
this one in
the
a different way.
So talking about weird, what was the weirdest thing that you learned or came across in either your research or your working through the story?
Um, some of the weirdest elements were actually true. So I have a friend who is descended from the Irish travelers, and the Irish travelers are a gypsy community.
Hmm.
And they still exist today. And so I was speaking to him and weaving the Irish travelers in because that's a whole nother world of folklore.
Hmm.
And just in talking to him, there were so many things that he gave me that he had witnessed or heard about that actually was that would happen. It's this weird mixture of occult practices and superstitions and Catholicism. He stopped me after church one day and he said, "Oh my goodness, there was a festival a couple of weeks ago and they worshiped a goat." And I
Hmm.
said, "I'm so glad to hear it because I wrote in a goat sacrifice. It's not visible, it's just referenced in the course of the novel. It just
Hmm.
seemed like we needed a goat sacrifice." Um,
As one
so,
does. Yeah.
as one does in this sort of eccentric country
Hmm.
setting where pious practices can so easily drift into not just eccentricity, but danger, which was
Hmm.
something that happened historically among the
Hmm.
Irish when the penal code was lifted, which I think was 18, no, 1868, something like that. I don't know. Father Thomas and Gilroy would know. I've forgotten the precise date. But when they lifted the penal code, which was as oppressive in Ireland as it was in England,
Hmm.
and all these priests started coming in to say, "All right, now we're going to stop doing all these things you're doing. Don't play with bodies at your wakes." The Irish turned on them and said, "Go away, you Italian invaders. We won't
Hmm.
listen to English and we won't listen to you. This is what we've always done."
Hmm.
So there was a real struggle for, who's going to be in charge of what's a pious practice and
Hmm.
who has authority at the church.
Hmm.
And that happened historically. So
Yeah.
it was it emerged in the novel, and I said, "Oh, well, this is good because that's historically accurate.
Hmm.
Maybe without zombies, but
Oh,
the zombies just make it more fun."
man, it's just fun and intriguing. This topic of the paranormal stuff and gosh, the phasing of pre-Christian religion into early Christianity and stuff like that specific stuff is absolutely riveting to me, and it's a complete side quest for today's conversation. So I won't even go there. But let's come back to your pet topic being on anti-Catholic sentiment in the Victorian period. So first of all, why did you pick that? And yeah, why did you pick that?
Well, I'm deeply in love with literature and have a special love for the 19th century. And I was really fascinated by inaccurate depictions of Catholicism, and they're
Mhm.
all over the place. I mean, you can't read Charlotte Bronte. Even Charles Dickens has moments where you say, "Wait, what?" And you
Yeah.
can see after the Reformation that there was such an effort at suppressing Catholic practices.
Mhm.
And I mean, the disenfranchisement, the persecution, it was incredible.
Mhm.
The Tudors were propaganda masters.
Mhm.
And the anti-Catholic narrative is so deeply ingrained now that you can even find it in otherwise respectable history books. There's a really
Mhm.
good new book by Joseph Pierce called Faith of Our Fathers, History of True England,
Okay.
where he just, I mean, it's all right there. As I told him, I said, "I think he's written so many important books. This might be the most important book that I think he's written. I wish
Mhm.
we'd had that book, you know, 25 years ago when I was falling in love with this topic." But I was loving it. I was loving literature, but picking up on the way that this anti-Catholic narrative was all over the place. And then I started noticing that in the Victorian period, especially in Gothic fiction, but not exclusively, you have this really weird dynamic of appropriating Catholic imagery aesthetically and Catholic characters because you want them to convey something, some deeper meaning. So you see this today. If you watch a movie and they want to show spiritual significance and spiritual depth, they
Mhm.
don't have Pastor Bob walk through, they have a
Yeah.
priest.
Yeah.
or a nun. And then
Well, there's a
everyone
lot
goes,
of it co-opted in
ooh.
manga as
Yeah,
well.
yes,
A lot
well,
of
it's all
these.
over the place
Yeah.
because it's how, what does this symbol mean?
Mhm.
And I was fascinated with the way that that developed across the Victorian period, culminating in Dracula, where Bram Stoker was not Catholic, but he was a Protestant Irishman, and his wife converted to Catholicism. Her early love had been Oscar Wilde, so there's a connection to
Mhm.
tormented eventual Catholicism. Um, and in Dracula, Bram Stoker throws in all the Catholic stuff wholesale. It's a mess.
Mhm.
But there are scenes like Jonathan Harker holding a rosary, clinging to it and saying, "Why does this console me? Is there a power in the thing itself? I'll think
Mhm.
about it sometime. But first, I just need to survive." Um, and there are so many theological errors. There's a
Mhm.
scene where Van Helsing smashes a consecrated host into putty and uses it to seal a tomb and says, "I have an indulgence," which is not what an indulgence is. It would be a dispensation, and you couldn't get a dispensation to desecrate the Eucharist. I mean, the whole
Oh
thing.
gosh.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's in there because it signifies something. And even in that particular scene, all the non-Catholic characters say, this makes us realize how much more serious the situation is because you're using that thing which to you is so sacred.
Mhm.
So there's that sort of significance in the presentation of Catholicism. For me, and this is my theory in graduate school, and I've returned to it several times, it seemed that it was an accustoming of the English palate to things Catholic, because at the end of that period, you have the emergence of the great era of the English Catholic novel. You have Josephine Ward, you have Chesterton, you have Tolkien, Yves Leroy, and they're being published by mainstream publishers
Mm.
and accepted in a new way. So you could see similar elements in Flannery O'Connor in the South, publishing
Mhm.
something with a deep Catholic theological premise and the
So
understanding of
interesting.
grace.
Yeah.
So it's this really interesting hinge where aestheticized Catholicism is something that is accepted in certain genres,
Mhm.
and that becomes an opportunity of expressing a Catholic worldview.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I like to say that if readers, non-Catholic readers, pick up a Gothic novel, they're already suspending disbelief so they can be more capable of stomaching a priest than you would in a domestic comedy. In a domestic comedy, you'd say, wow, this is preachy and obnoxious. Why are these Catholics here?
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you've got zombies, vampires, and werewolves,
Let's
of
get
course you want
existential.
the priest there, you know?
Right. You mentioned earlier about an exorcist, and that reminded me there's that new movie that came out, The Pope's Exorcist, with Russell Crowe. I don't know if you saw that, but it
Haven't.
was um I didn't love it. It felt like a Marvel take on an exorcism drama, exorcism story. But I will say what I did love was his portrayal of the central character, whether or not it's actually Father Amorth or something. But he's in the moments where things are serious, he's very serious, and then as soon as the seriousness or the gravity goes away and the evil disappears or something, um, he will return to being just jocular and friendly and funny and an incredibly warm human, okay, passionate and angry and so on. But what you don't have is the kind of uh, Frollo, right, from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. You don't have that kind of a serious, shell-shocked exorcist. In fact, he's very a bit like Father Brown, just upbeat and friendly. When time to be serious, he's like very serious, and then other times. And when I saw that, I remember thinking, okay, I will trust that kind of exorcist, that kind of
Yes.
person dealing with these paranormal, preternatural things. Somebody who is um, may not be, I don't know, he's not exactly very cerebral in the story, but you do sense he's all there. There's a real warm
Yeah.
human being there, and that was, anyhow, I thought that was fun. So, okay, so with that research that you did do, I actually never considered, now that you bring it up, the context of when people like Tolkien and Flannery were creating these things, how anti-Catholic popular media was at the time. And so to find something that, like you said, would get published and then would go viral and stand the test of time, um, just goes to show how not only riveting the stories are, but how compelling the messages are for
Yeah.
representing the human condition, not
Yeah.
just a tribal, here's how we view the world. It's like these things actually resonate. If you strip away the labels, the stories and the content actually resonates with us and how we actually experience being alive. Um, as you ladder that now into modern day, so having that research, now you're looking at a lot of
Yeah.
fiction and stuff going on today. What do you think is going on now, or what are your biggest objections now, or maybe where things are actually just very interesting with media now?
I see a tremendous amount of potential right now, in part because there seem to be several schools of literary success, most of which are not at all interesting to me. One really big avenue for literary success these days is a sort of navel-gazing approach to the world.
Hmm.
I mean, Charles Dickens is one of my favorite authors. I don't read to look at myself. I read to see the glorious splendor of God's creation. And that can, I mean, I think there's a phenomenon, for example, in the Gothic, that it's like a funhouse mirror. So part of it is at a certain point, as you're gazing at things monstrous, there's a moment of, I understand the monstrous because I am a fallen human being in need of grace. So there's that awesome mechanism that you can see, but a whole novel that would just be about the interiority of a slightly stressed homeschooling mother living out her day-to-day life, that sounds boring to me and it would not give me joy. So it's like, I know I live it, but I would rather see a panoply of characters. I would like to see an imaginative world.
Mm.
And you
Where
can
are my
see
dragons, right?
exactly. I would you can see that. People are hungry for that.
Mhm.
Most of is oversexed and or it's just badly written, but you can see those sorts of phenomena emerging,
Mhm.
and mostly in speculative fiction, I'd say. It's the
Mhm.
so-called realist fiction takes itself so seriously that they just can't, just stop for a second and
Mhm.
laugh and supplicate themselves. So so I can see that potential, and it isn't largely among Catholics, not exclusively, but largely among Catholics, and I can see growing literary circles, which gives me a great deal of joy, because if you think about the communities and relationships that fostered
Mhm.
great writers in the past, we can perhaps see a revival that's going on, but it's beginning on a sort of grassroots level of readers who love to read, writers who love to write, and who have the metaphysical framework for it to have depth.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so hopefully that's a good answer. I don't know. So that gives me hope. It doesn't mean that I think any of us are going to make $1 million, but you know what? We probably would not be happy. Father this morning at Mass was preaching. He said, praying for God not to make me poor, not to make me rich, but to give me what I need. So
Mhm.
I pray the same for literature, Catholic
Yeah.
literature.
Wow. Um, so on the topic of weird, as we start to wrap, weirdest story you've ever read that you actually liked?
You could put anything by Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay.
Wow, Poe weirds me out.
Oh.
There was also a novel by E.M. Braddon. No, yes, is it E.M. Braddon? Yes, it is E.M. Braddon. It's called The Trail of the Serpent. I don't remember the plot.
Mm.
All I remember is this early scene where someone's in bed and wakes up and sees the villain climbing in the window, washing blood off his hands in a basin, then drinking the blood from the basin and going to bed. I don't remember anything else about that book,
Mhm.
but that was so weird. Especially the thing that I think creeps me out the most is the idea that then the villain went to bed.
Mhm.
Having finished whatever he was doing, he went to bed. That's this weird juxtaposition of normal human behavior and something revolting and
Absolutely
terrifying. So,
psychopathic.
yes.
Yeah.
So put that up with Edgar Allan Poe, and that's pretty much Poe is so strange. When not his detective fiction, but
Mhm.
his like the is it the Telltale Heart? Oh, I still
What do you think he was accomplishing there? Just weird for weird's sake, or was he actually doing something? Or is it like, just flexing a creative muscle and just creating weird things? Or was he trying to accomplish something, do you think?
I think he was still part of a movement. This partly is what begat the Gothic,
Mm.
this reaction against Protestant and Enlightenment hyperclarity.
Hmm.
Like we're so
Okay.
reasonable, we're so rational.
Hmm.
And the Romantics, the Gothics, and writers like Edgar Allan Poe responded, yes, but what about the supreme weirdness that I encounter every single day? What about the monstrousness that is in me? So I
Hmm.
think that was in part what he was doing was just addressing the complex weirdness,
Mhm.
which that word is also interesting. I was teaching this in a class the other day. The origin of the word, if we look back to the Old English, means in some mythologies, it's fate, destiny, but in a Catholic understanding, it means the weirdness of God's providence. So even looking at some dark stories like Edgar Allan Poe's, they're very dark,
Mhm.
having a sense that the very weirdness is a moment, a possibility for redemption. Although Poe protagonists don't usually get the redemption. They don't usually get it, but it could happen.
Yeah, yeah.
They don't usually get it.
That right there strikes me as, how do you say? And it's a valuable reason for a novel or for a story, even if all it does is it does what you just described, is it flexes an experience or a reminder of something that, let's say, modern culture or, normalized Christianity today um, doesn't encounter, hasn't created space for. And so to go and just do that in a story,
Mhm.
even if it doesn't end up with a Jesus lion or a come to Aslan moment.
Yeah.
But if there's purely, here's something you didn't consider that is a real part of the human experience, now feel your way through this. And now go and think about your faith and how to actually, here's all the stuff that you've missed out on. I think that's actually a role for a lot of creators and especially artists and well, musicians maybe. I don't know enough about that. But fiction or the vocation, people on a vocation as a writer is to creators have always done this to look at, well, what if we relegated to the fringe? What have we ignored in our attempt to normalize things and create a sane human society? Problem is, there's truth that's been thrown out with the bathwater in the fringes, and we don't know what to do about that. Um, and there's more often than not, all the stuff that we actually need to learn is in those areas, and those end up being usually fairly weird.
Well, and I think too, if you are pursuing, if you're writing and you are open to the story and the story is authentically human, that will happen naturally. There's one big struggle I do see among Catholic writers is they sit down and say, this is going to be the meaning. And then all of a sudden you read something. And like you said, the Jesus lion moment when you go, oh my, only C.S. Lewis can carry it off, but most of us can't. So I was joking to a friend just the other day about Wake of Malice. I said, I'm really excited to find out what the book's about from talking to readers because I wrote it, but that doesn't mean I exactly know. I think there's some
Yeah.
themes I know. Like I said, I think it's about death, but I don't know. I don't know because all I did was write the story.
Yeah.
But I think that the more that you're open to expressing the story and
Mhm.
not preaching or proselytizing Catholicism, but authentically presenting a Catholic worldview, whether
Mhm.
it's in terms of having Catholic characters or just articulating the operation of grace
Mhm.
in human life, the need for
Yeah.
redemption, which are themes you have to have in a good Gothic novel. Then you'll have a compelling story with
Yeah.
characters who reveal something, like you said, that's deeply, deeply human. Like I said to my son the other day when he was complaining about being in church, why are we here all the time? And I said, because mommy is not strong enough to be good without Jesus. And he sort of looked at me and sort of sat a little stiller, like, whoa, what's that supposed to mean? But I said, it's true. I am not strong enough to be good without Jesus. That is why we're here this morning. He's 5. And he is going through a phase where he's not like sitting still at church. But that also for him to recognize, that's a reality I struggle with. Well, that's a reality that every single character struggles with too. Without grace, we are all monsters.
And there's a great place to wrap, friends. So, Eleanor, where can people find you online? And you had mentioned a gift for those who like watching or following this channel. And yeah, where can people find you online?
I have a website, eleanorbourgnicholson.com. And you can also find me at major booksellers. And my 2 recent novels are from Chrism Press. And I highly recommend that you become followers of Chrism Press. If you order books from me directly, I can send them to you signed, and you can use a coupon code legend15 and it'll knock 15% off, which will basically knock out the shipping and make us competitive with Amazon. So you can get it autographed, but close to the same price. But so Legend 15 at my personal website, You can also find me on Facebook, sometimes on Instagram. Uh, but just don't expect too much of an output because I fall asleep these days while trying to homeschool children and get everything else done.